The village of Kadena sat in the grip of tension. Surrounded by the deep forests of Okinawa and cradled by distant hills, the small settlement seemed untouched by the chaos of the ongoing war. The people of Kadena lived their lives in a fragile semblance of normalcy, isolated from the brutal reality unfolding just beyond their borders. For the children, it was another ordinary day of playing in the streets and learning in makeshift classrooms. The adults, however, knew the air was thick with something unspoken, a fear that gripped their hearts even as they tried to carry on with their daily routines. The local school, which had been a place of joy and laughter for the younger generation, now echoed with whispers of impending doom. The teachers tried to maintain some semblance of order, but the war had seeped into the very walls of the classroom. Propaganda posters lined the hallways, each one a reminder of the enemy that awaited at the gates. The children were taught more than just reading and writing. They were instructed in the art of war, in the ideals of sacrifice and martyrdom. The imperial forces had ingrained a deep sense of duty in them, but at what cost? For many, this education was all they knew, and it shaped their view of the world. In the afternoons, when the heat of the day began to wane, the children would gather on the dusty streets, their laughter rising above the tension that hung in the air. They were unaware of the dark clouds forming on the horizon, clouds that would soon cast a shadow over their innocent lives. The games they played, the songs they sang, were full of vigor and youthful energy, but there was an underlying sense that these moments were fleeting. As they ran through the narrow alleyways and jumped over the small puddles left from the morning rains, they were unaware that their childhood was slipping away, replaced by something far more dangerous. The adults in Kadena, on the other hand, were burdened with the knowledge that war had already touched their lives in ways they could not undo. They had seen the soldiers marching through the village in the early days of the conflict, their faces grim and determined. There were whispers in the marketplace about the Japanese military's preparations, about the defensive measures being taken in anticipation of an American invasion. Some of the men had been conscripted to join the forces, while others had been left behind to protect their homes and families. The women, too, were caught in the grip of fear as they prepared their children for what seemed to be an inevitable clash with the enemy. As the war raged on in other parts of the world, Kadena's isolation offered a sense of temporary safety. The villagers were used to living in the shadow of war, and the occasional passing of a military convoy or the distant sounds of gunfire were just part of the backdrop of their lives. They had learned to adjust, to live with the tension, even if they didn't fully understand the forces that were shaping their fate. The days passed slowly, each one carrying the weight of uncertainty, each one a reminder that the war was coming and that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The village itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The houses, simple and unadorned, stood like silent sentinels, their windows boarded up against the coming storm. The elders gathered in small groups, their voices low as they discussed the future, or perhaps the lack of one. The younger generation, still hopeful and full of life, had no way of knowing how the world was about to change. They could not foresee the invasion that was coming, or the lives that would be lost in its wake. And yet, there were those who still clung to the belief that they could survive. The villagers of Kadena had been taught to endure, to fight, and to protect their homes at all costs. But as the war drew nearer, the question on everyone's mind was whether their way of life could withstand the oncoming tide of violence. The thought of surrender was unthinkable. To even consider it was a betrayal of everything they had been taught. The belief in sacrifice and duty was so deeply ingrained that it overshadowed any sense of self-preservation. The arrival of the American troops, though still distant, was a constant topic of conversation in the village. Every rumor, every piece of information was scrutinized for any sign of what was to come. The villagers knew that the Americans were not just soldiers, they were invaders, monsters in the eyes of the propaganda that had shaped their minds for years. They had been told that the Americans would show no mercy, that they would destroy everything in their path. The fear was palpable, and it took on a life of its own, growing stronger with each passing day. As the sun began to set on that ordinary day, the quiet of the village was broken by a sound that no one had expected, the distant rumble of tanks. The earth seemed to shake beneath their feet, and for the first time, the reality of what was happening outside the village walls felt real. The villagers fell into a stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. The American forces were approaching, and Kadena was about to face a challenge unlike any it had ever known. In that moment, there was no turning back. The village of Kadena, once a place of simple life and peace, would soon be thrust into the chaos of war. The children would no longer play in the streets. The men and women would have to decide whether to live or die for their country. And the innocence that had once defined their lives would be lost forever. The morning of the attack dawned in a heavy silence, the kind that made the world feel distant and unreal. The sun rose over the hills of Kadena, casting long shadows over the rice paddies and wooden homes that had once been so familiar. Yet today, the village felt different. The birds did not sing, and the rustling of the trees was muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. In the distance, the sounds of artillery fire had become louder, more frequent, a grim reminder that the war was no longer far away. The villagers could feel the tension building, a palpable weight that pressed down on them from all sides. Rumors had been circulating for weeks, but now the reality was undeniable. The American soldiers were coming, and they were closer than anyone had dared to imagine. The roads that had once been the paths of simple farmers and merchants now seemed like lifelines to an uncertain future. The men and women of Kadena gathered in hushed groups, exchanging worried glances and hurried whispers, unsure of what to do, unsure of what was coming. The children, sensing the change in the air, grew quieter than usual. They played in the dirt, but their laughter was forced, hollow. The games they had once enjoyed now felt out of place in a world that was crumbling before them. No one spoke of the war openly, but every glance, every motion betrayed the fear that had taken root in their hearts. For many of them, this was the first time they had felt the true weight of what war meant. They had been taught to fear the Americans, to see them as monsters, but now they were about to witness them firsthand. The women of Kadena were no less afraid. They gathered in their homes, speaking in low voices as they prepared for the worst. Some took to the basements, hiding their children under blankets and beneath old furniture, while others stood by the windows, watching the distant clouds of dust rise from the roads. They had been taught how to protect their families, how to make the ultimate sacrifice, but none of them were prepared for the sight of American soldiers marching down their streets. They knew what they had to do, but the fear of the unknown made their hands tremble. At the same time, the men of Kadena gathered in secret. They were not only fathers and husbands, they were soldiers too. Some had already been conscripted into the army, while others had been left behind to defend their homes. They were used to hardship, used to war, but this was different. This was the enemy coming to their doorstep, not the distant, faceless force they had heard about in news broadcasts, but a very real and terrifying presence. They spoke in urgent tones about resistance, about what they would do when the Americans arrived. But deep down, they too were unsure. The idea of surrender was anathema to them, but they also understood that survival was a far more complicated matter than they had ever been taught. As the day wore on, the villagers began to feel the first tremors of what was to come. The ground shook with the distant thud of artillery, the vibrations reverberating through the walls of their homes. The trees swayed, their branches groaning under the pressure, and the air grew thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. The children looked up at their parents with wide eyes, sensing something in the atmosphere that they couldn't fully comprehend. The parents, in turn, looked at each other with unspoken understanding, knowing that they could not shield their children from the horrors that were about to unfold. The first signs of the American advance came in the form of an eerie rumble. It wasn't just the sound of tanks or artillery. It was the sound of something far more frightening, the sound of something unstoppable. The earth itself seemed to tremble as the American forces moved closer, and with every passing second, the villagers felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on them. There was no more time for preparation, no more time for hiding. The time for action had arrived, and all they could do now was wait. As the sun set on Cadena, a thick fog of fear settled over the village. The once familiar landscape now seemed alien, suffused with a sense of dread that hung in the air like a heavy mist. The children were no longer playing in the streets, their laughter replaced by the occasional sound of soft crying. The adults sat in their homes, gathered in small groups, their faces drawn and pale. They had done all they could to prepare, and now they had no choice but to wait for the inevitable. In the distance, the sounds of the American forces grew louder. The steady march of boots on dirt, the roar of engines, the rumble of artillery. It was impossible to ignore. The villagers of Cadena had been living in fear for so long that it had become a part of their daily lives. But now that fear had turned into something far more real. The Americans were coming, and the only thing left to do was face them. As the night wore on, the people of Cadena huddled together in the dark, each person silently contemplating what would come next. Would they fight? Would they die? Would they survive? The answers to those questions were uncertain, but one thing was clear: everything was about to change. The war, which had seemed so distant and abstract just days ago, had now arrived at their doorstep, and there was no turning back. The stillness of the village was shattered by the distant sound of artillery fire. It was not a single explosion, but a series of booms, echoing like thunder in the heavens. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of each blast, the ground trembling beneath their feet. For the villagers of Cadena, this was no longer just a distant threat. It was now a reality, shaking them to their core. The war, which had been so far removed from their daily lives, had finally reached their doorstep. Mothers rushed to gather their children, pulling them close and whispering words of comfort that held little meaning in the face of impending destruction. Fathers scrambled to secure their homes, boarding up windows, reinforcing doors, anything to hold back the inevitable. The panic was palpable, thick in the air, as the first wave of bombings began to fall. The village, once peaceful and familiar, was now a battleground. The familiar sights, the rice fields, the winding dirt paths, suddenly seemed strange, transformed by the violence of war. The sound of exploding shells filled the air, a constant barrage that did not seem to stop. With each explosion, the villagers ducked lower, their heads buried in their hands, their hearts pounding with fear. It was impossible to escape the noise, impossible to avoid the terror that was sweeping through the village like a wave. The walls of their homes groaned under the pressure of the blasts, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift with each new impact. Children huddled together in basements, their small hands clasped in fear, their wide eyes glancing nervously at their parents. It was no longer a game. There was no pretending that everything was fine. The innocence of childhood, once protected by the comforting illusion of safety, was quickly stripped away as the war swept through their lives with brutal force. The adults tried to comfort them, but the words seemed hollow, empty in the face of the destruction that surrounded them. For the men of Cadena, the bombings were a cruel reminder of their duty. Some had already been conscripted into the military, sent off to fight on distant battlefields. But for the others, those left behind to protect their families, the war had come to them. They stood at the ready, weapons in hand, not knowing what would come next. Should they fight? Should they stay hidden? The uncertainty of their situation made every decision feel like a gamble, every moment an impossible choice. As the bombs continued to fall, the villagers' thoughts turned to the soldiers they had been taught to fear. They had been told that the Americans were ruthless invaders, monsters who would show no mercy. But the fear of the unknown was now being replaced by something else, something far more real. They had seen the devastation wrought by the bombs, felt the tremors beneath their feet. The enemy, the soldiers they had been taught to fear, were not just a concept now. They were a tangible presence, and they were coming. In the midst of the chaos, the women of Kadena clung to each other. They shared stories of survival, their voices trembling with uncertainty. Some had lived through previous bombings, but this felt different. This was not just an air raid. It was the beginning of something far more terrible. Their husbands and fathers had been drafted, leaving them behind to face the coming storm. They had always been the ones to bear the weight of the home front, but now the burden was heavier than ever. The children clung to their mothers, seeking comfort in their warmth, their small hands gripping tightly. There was no time for play now, no time for the carefree laughter that had once filled the village. Instead, there was only fear, a palpable fear that gripped them all. They had been taught to endure, to survive, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of what was happening. Their lives, once so predictable, were now in danger, and there was no way to predict what would come next. Outside, the explosions continued to rock the village, and the ground trembled beneath the force of each blast. The once peaceful streets of Kadena were now littered with debris, the remnants of homes, crops, and livelihoods scattered in the wake of the bombing. The once familiar landmarks were now unrecognizable, twisted and broken by the power of war. It was as if the very earth beneath their feet had been torn apart, leaving only destruction in its wake. In the midst of this chaos, one thought lingered in the minds of the villagers: survival. For most, it was not a question of victory or defeat. It was simply a matter of living through the next few hours. Would they survive this? Would their homes, their families, their lives be spared? It was a question that none of them could answer, and the uncertainty only deepened their fear. The American soldiers had arrived, and now all they could do was wait for the inevitable. As the day wore on, the bombings showed no sign of stopping. The villagers remained in their hiding places, praying that the worst was over, that somehow they would be spared. But deep down, they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The war had come to Kadena, and with it, the promise of destruction. As the bombs continued to fall, the villagers of Kadena huddled deeper into their homes, their fear intensifying with each passing moment. The distant rumble of artillery was relentless, shaking the earth beneath their feet, and the air seemed to vibrate with the constant roar of war. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional silhouette of a soldier darting between buildings, their faces grim and determined. The once peaceful village was now a war zone, its quiet innocence shattered by the devastation that surrounded it. No one knew when it would end, or if it ever would. In the heart of the chaos, amidst the ruins of what had once been a home, lay a woman and her child. Tomoko Ishikawa, a mother of 8, had taken refuge in the basement of her house, clutching her son, Riku, close to her chest. The sound of the artillery was deafening, and the vibrations from the explosions made the ground beneath them tremble. She tried to calm Riku, whispering words of reassurance, but there was little comfort she could offer. The world outside was a nightmare, and in that moment, all she could do was pray that they would survive. Tomoko's thoughts raced, but her focus remained on her son. She had raised him in the shadow of war, teaching him how to survive, how to endure the hardships of a world torn apart by violence. She had always feared this day would come, but now that it had, she found herself powerless. The fear she had carried in her heart for so long was now a living, breathing entity, and it had taken hold of everything she loved. Outside, the fighting was growing more intense. The Americans had arrived, and the sound of their tanks and soldiers moving through the village filled the air. Tomoko had heard rumors of what the Americans did, stories of soldiers who raped, killed, and destroyed everything in their path. But none of that prepared her for the reality of hearing their voices so close, for the cold truth that the enemy was no longer a distant figure in the shadows. They were here. As the bombs continued to fall, Tomoko pressed her ear to the floor, listening for any sign of the soldiers' movements. She heard the sounds of boots marching through the streets, the clanging of weapons, and the occasional shout. Her heart raced as she realized how close they were. If the Americans found them, they would have no choice but to surrender, to give up their lives in a world where survival no longer seemed possible. And then it happened. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Tomoko heard a voice, foreign, strange, and unmistakable. It was English, the language of the enemy. At first, she froze, unsure of what to do. The words were unfamiliar, but the tone was not filled with anger or hatred. Instead, there was a strange urgency, a plea for help. She barely dared to believe what she was hearing. Could it be? Was this really happening?
Is anyone alive? This time in a broken, hesitant Japanese. Is anyone alive? It asked, the words shaky but clear. We help, we help.
Tomoko's heart skipped a beat. This was not the cruelty she had been taught to expect. The Americans, the monsters, the demons, had they come to save them? She could hardly believe it. In her mind, there was only one thing to do: stay silent, stay hidden, and hope the soldiers would move on without finding them. But the sound of her son's soft sobbing beneath her broke through the silence. Riku, scared and confused, was clinging to her, his small body trembling in fear. She couldn't stay quiet any longer. Desperation gripped her, and without thinking, she shouted out, "Help! Help us!" The words left her lips before she could stop them, and immediately she regretted it. Her mind screamed for her to be silent, to wait, to hide, but it was too late. She had already spoken. The rubble around them shifted, and from the dust emerged a figure, a man in green, his uniform foreign and out of place amidst the destruction. He was cautious, slow, his movements hesitant as he approached the fallen house. He held his hands up, palms open, as if to show that he meant no harm. His face was young, his eyes wide with concern, and his posture was one of caution, as if he too feared the unknown. Tomoko froze, her heart racing as she stared at the soldier. He was American, there was no doubt about it, but he didn't look like the monster she had been taught to fear. There was no rage in his eyes, no hunger for destruction. Instead, there was something else, a kind of uncertainty, even fear, that mirrored her own. He glanced at Riku, who was still crying, pinned beneath the debris, and then back at Tomoko, his gaze softening. Without a word, he knelt beside them, his hands reaching toward the beam that was trapping her son. Tomoko's instinct screamed at her to push him away, to refuse his help, but she could see that he wasn't there to hurt them. He wasn't there to destroy their lives. He was there to save them. She watched in stunned silence as he carefully examined the beam, assessing the situation with calm precision. His hands, though rough from battle, moved with care as he pressed against the beam, trying to lift it. With every inch the soldier moved it, Tomoko's hope began to grow. This was real. This wasn't the monster she had imagined. This was a man, just like her, trying to save a life. She had been wrong all along. The enemy was not what she had been told to fear. In this moment, in the face of death, she realized that there was more to this war than she had ever understood. The soldier, whose language she did not speak, and whose country she had been taught to hate, was now the one who might save her son. The beam shifted, and with a final push, the soldier managed to free Riku's leg. Tomoko's breath caught in her throat as she pulled her son to her chest, cradling him in her arms. He cried out in pain, but he was free. He was alive. The man had done what no one else could. The American soldier had saved her son, and in doing so had shattered everything she thought she knew about the enemy. The weight of what had just happened settled on Tomoko like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts and slowing her movements. She held her son close, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, and yet her mind was still trying to comprehend the soldier's actions. The American had risked his life to save her son. He had entered the heart of the chaos, disregarding the dangers surrounding him, just to pull a child from the wreckage. This was not the image of the enemy she had been raised to fear, but a man who acted with a courage she could not fully understand. Tomoko's hands trembled as she brushed the dirt from Riku's face, her heart still pounding in her chest. The soldier, who had just risked everything, was now in trouble himself. He had been shot. She had seen it. His legs had buckled beneath him when the bullet struck. Her eyes scanned the battlefield, the chaos unfolding around them. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and explosions still shook the ground. But her focus was on the man who had saved her son. He was lying on the ground, clutching his shoulder, where the blood was already beginning to stain his uniform. She wanted to help him, to return the favor, but she had no idea how. She had no training, no medical knowledge. She was just a mother, terrified and unsure of what to do next. Yet, as she looked at the soldier, she knew that she couldn't just leave him there, not after everything he had done. She had been taught to hate the Americans, to see them as monsters. But this man, this soldier, had shown her nothing but humanity. The war outside their small corner of destruction continued to rage. But in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. She took a step toward the soldier, her legs unsteady, her mind still in a haze. She reached him slowly, her eyes never leaving his bloodied form. His eyes were open, but his gaze was unfocused, as if he were trying to hold on to the last thread of consciousness. The reality of what he had done, what he had sacrificed, was beginning to hit her fully. This was no longer a battle between enemies. It was a battle between life and death, between the possibility of survival and the inevitability of loss. She crouched beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to assess his wound. The blood flowed freely, staining the earth beneath him. There was no time to waste. The sound of footsteps approached, but Tomoko didn't look up. Her thoughts were solely on the soldier. She knew she couldn't save him on her own, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had to try. The soldier's breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She could hear the faint sounds of the battle raging on in the distance, but it felt as if time had slowed. In this moment, the world outside was irrelevant. Her entire focus was on this man who had shown her the truth of what war could be. The soldier had not come to kill. He had come to save, and now he was paying the price for it. Tears welled in Tomoko's eyes as she pressed her hands against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. She was desperate, unsure of what to do, but she couldn't let him die. Not after everything he had done for her son. She had heard stories of American soldiers, monsters who took no prisoners, who showed no mercy. But this man, lying before her, was nothing like the enemy she had been taught to fear. In this moment, he was a man, a human being, fighting for survival just as she had fought for her sons.
Suddenly, there was movement behind her. Tomoko glanced over her shoulder, and she saw a few other villagers cautiously approaching, their faces tense, filled with uncertainty. They had been watching from the shadows, waiting to see what would unfold. They too had been raised with the same beliefs, the same hatred for the Americans. But now, witnessing what had happened, the sight of the soldiers' sacrifice was beginning to unravel everything they had ever known.
An older man, his hair graying at the temples, stepped forward. He had been one of the village elders, a man who had lived through countless hardships and seen the horrors of war firsthand. His eyes, hardened by years of struggle, softened as he approached the fallen soldier. He knelt beside Tomoko, his hands gentle as they examined the American's injury. Without a word, he nodded to the others, signaling for them to bring what little medical supplies they had. The villagers, who had once feared these soldiers as demons, now understood the truth. There was more to the story than they had been told. The elderly man worked quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. Tomoko stayed by the soldier's side, her eyes never leaving him. She could see the struggle in his face, the pain that he was trying to hide. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body growing weaker by the minute. But through it all, there was a sense of calm in his eyes, a calm that had never been present in the soldiers she had been taught to hate. The villagers, who had once been ready to fight, now found themselves uncertain. The American soldier had not only saved a child, but he had given them something even more precious, the chance to see beyond their fears, beyond the propaganda that had shaped their world. In that brief moment, they understood that humanity could exist even in the most unlikely places. As the elder continued to tend to the soldier's wound, Tomoko remained close, her hands still trembling. She had been raised to believe that the Americans were the enemy, but now, in the face of the soldier's sacrifice, she saw the truth. The war was not as simple as good versus evil. It was about people, about choices, and about the lives that were changed by those choices. The soldier, whose name she still didn't know, had given everything for a child he had never met. In that act of bravery, he had shown her the depth of human compassion. By the time the sun began to set over the ruined village, the soldier's breathing had steadied. He had not yet regained consciousness, but his condition had stabilized. The villagers, once ready to strike back at the Americans, now found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. The war, with all its destruction and pain, had not only torn apart their village, it had opened their eyes to a deeper truth, one that could never be ignored again. The days that followed the soldier's sacrifice felt surreal for the villagers of Kadena. The once familiar rhythms of their lives were now disrupted, replaced by a quiet reflection that hovered over the community like a cloud. The American soldier, who had given his life to save a child, was not just a figure of pity, he was a symbol, an anomaly in a world that had painted enemies in broad, hateful strokes. Tomoko, who had witnessed the soldier's bravery firsthand, now saw the village through new eyes. The deep-seated fear and mistrust that had been drilled into her from childhood seemed trivial in comparison to the profound humanity she had just witnessed. Despite the brutal realities of war that still surrounded them, the villagers began to gather in small groups, their conversations hushed and thoughtful. They spoke of the soldier, of his actions, and of the implications of his sacrifice. No longer were the Americans viewed solely as monsters. The man who had thrown himself into harm's way to protect her son, and who had died as a result, had altered everything.
The elders, who had long been the guardians of the village's values, now found themselves questioning the very teachings they had once imparted. The question echoed in the quiet corners of the village. Was it possible that they had been wrong all along? Tomoko found herself visiting the soldier's makeshift grave every day. She did not know his name, but she had seen enough to understand the depth of his actions. As she stood by the small mound of earth, her thoughts would wander to what had driven him to risk so much for a child who wasn't his own. Was it courage, compassion, or something more fundamental, something that transcended nationalities and boundaries? In the solitude of those moments, she realized that the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the choice he had made, the choice to act when others might have stood by. As word of the soldier's actions spread throughout the village, something remarkable began to happen. The villagers, who had once shunned the idea of cooperation with the Americans, now found themselves conflicted. They had always been taught to fight to the death rather than surrender, to hold on to their dignity by any means necessary. But the events of the past few days had shifted something deep within them. They began to see that not all Americans were their enemies. Not all soldiers were merciless. The lines between us and them had blurred, and in their place there was a space for understanding, however faint. Riku, Tomoko's son, had been the catalyst for this change, though he would never understand the magnitude of it. As the days passed and he recovered from his injury, he began to ask questions about the soldier who had saved him. Tomoko would tell him the same story each time, recounting the way the soldier had acted without hesitation, without regard for his own safety. It was not a story of victory or defeat, but of sacrifice, an act that transcended the conflict around them. Riku would listen intently, his young mind trying to reconcile the image of the American soldier with the fear that had been instilled in him. But as time passed, it was clear that he was beginning to see things differently. The villagers began to help the American forces, albeit cautiously. At first, they offered only the barest form of cooperation, a few scraps of food, a quiet nod of acknowledgement. But as the days wore on, and as the Americans continued to rebuild the village, the lines of animosity softened. Some villagers helped carry injured soldiers. Others worked to clear the rubble that had once been their homes. There was a strange humility in their actions, a sense that they were helping not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. They had witnessed the possibility of human compassion in the midst of the war, and they were not willing to let that experience fade. As more days passed, the village's attitude continued to shift. The once grim faces of the villagers began to soften, and the children, who had long been taught to hate, now found themselves drawn to the American soldiers. They would watch them work, observing the way the soldiers interacted with each other and with the villagers. There was no anger in the soldiers' eyes, no cruelty in their words. Instead, there was laughter, kindness, and a willingness to engage. The children would run and play near the soldiers, their fear forgotten. It was a strange thing for the adults to witness, but it was also a welcome one. The next generation was learning a new way to view the world. For Tomoko, the most profound change occurred not in the actions of the village, but in herself. She had come to see the Americans not as faceless monsters, but as people, flawed, imperfect, but capable of great kindness. Her heart, once hardened by the fears of war, now held a place for forgiveness, however small. She had been ready to die for her country, to sacrifice her family and herself for an ideal. But now she saw the value in life, her own and others. She saw it in the soldier who had given everything for a child he didn't know. She saw it in the faces of the villagers who had come together to help rebuild what had been destroyed. The soldiers, too, began to change. They were no longer just conquerors, but people who had seen the pain of war up close. Sergeant Henley, the medic who had saved Riku, never regained full health. His injury had left him with a limp, a constant reminder of the price he had paid.
Yet he remained in Kadena for weeks after the initial fighting, helping to rebuild, offering medical care, and speaking with the villagers. His actions had not gone unnoticed. He had become something more than a soldier. He had become a bridge between two worlds that had once been divided by hatred. As the weeks turned into months, Kadena began to recover. The village, scarred by war, slowly regained its strength. The people returned to the fields. The sounds of children's laughter filled the streets once more, and the once silent homes became filled with life. But the most lasting change was not physical, it was in the hearts of the people. They had seen the humanity of their enemy, and in doing so, they had found their own. Tomoko often returned to the grave of the American soldier. She would sit quietly beside it, reflecting on the changes she had witnessed. In the quiet moments, as the wind rustled through the trees, she would remember the soldier's face and the price he had paid for her son's life. She would think of the courage it had taken for him to do what he did, and she would feel a deep sense of gratitude, a gratitude that would never be fully expressed. The story of his sacrifice had become a part of her, a part of the village, and in the hearts of all who had witnessed it, it would never be forgotten.